and in a bit to calm the conversation a bit, I want to go to the phase where we talk about social media as a catalyst for conflict. Specifically, I want to start with Matthew in this part of the conversation. And we're going to start with foreign and external intervention into the NSAS protests. Matthew, during the protest, when it started on October 8th, external pressure on the Nigerian government to address the protest and then to act on all of the allegations and accusations that was leveled against it after the killing was a bit slow. And I remember I saw a tweet, your tweets, Matthew, at the United States government, at the United Kingdom's government, at the Canada government, and you wanted them to pressure the Nigerian government into acting. And my question is, why does the Nigerian government require external diplomatic pressure to deal with a domestic affair?
That's an excellent question. And yes, I was probably a little vocal at the time. Casting stones at my old colleagues and old employer, the U.S. State Department, and my friends at the High Commission and the Canadian, the UK High Commission and the Canadian High Commission, because I thought that their response was weak and insufficient. All of those countries pride themselves and on their support for civil society, on their support for democracy and governance in Nigeria. And for the most part, although there were some differences in terms of their response to the Lekki killings and also to the protests in general, their response was insufficient, and they became very cautious. They became very concerned, I think, about how the Nigerian government would react to their criticism and comments. We know that the Nigerian government sort of has this love-hate relationship with the international community. While on the one hand, they will shake their fists at, Washington and London and decry this foreign interference. We remember how in his, one of his inaugural speeches in Washington in July 2015, President Buhari claimed that U.S. human rights laws were aiding and abetting Boko Haram. He especially, as we know, is very resistant to that sort of constructive criticism from friends, longtime friends and partners. He views it as sort of impertinent in many ways. And so to a great extent, I think the diplomatic missions in Nigeria and to a lesser extent Washington and London, who to a large extent are not necessarily tuned into what's going on in Nigeria day to day, have been house trained by this pushback from the Nigerian government. And it's not just this particular dispensation. I remember being at the State Department back in 2014 when, the late Ambassador Adafuye would come in and sort of levy these same types of, this same type of pushback against U.S. criticism of Nigeria's human rights record. Because again, as Seun has sort of mentioned, I mean, this, gross human rights violations are not the province of, the Buhari administration. I mean, they were taking place under the Jonathan administration, Yar'Adua, Obasanjo, Abacha. I mean, we go back and back and back. These are institutionalized behaviors. Yes, I mean, we'll be talking about it when there's a new president in 2023 about how this is a problem. But anyway, back to this issue of international criticism. Yes, it was very weak. The U.S. was especially weak. It equivocated on whether or not the Lekki massacre even happened. Those on the phone call, Rinu, Seun, will be familiar with the sort of really shameful 2020 human rights report, in which the U.S. Embassy clearly sort of massaged some of the language to equivocate about whether or not the Lekki massacre even happened. Some outside observers might attribute that to the fact that Trump was in office, and as we know, the Trump administration was, almost promoted gross human rights violations by the Nigerian military. I mean, they had no compunction in sort of withholding criticism about the problems that were going on. But in fact, I think, what this again reflects is just a cautious approach, a real conciliatory and almost clientelistic approach by U.S. diplomats in Abuja. And that's why, again, we've seen it still under the Biden administration. We've seen a sort of a continued very muted response to some of these issues. I mean, it's better, but it's by no means good in terms of what is necessary. And I think that, your question as to why are Nigerian elites, or, why do they require diplomatic pressure to manage these domestic affairs? I don't think it's so much that they require that pressure in terms of behavioral change, because that behavioral change has not been forthcoming in any discernible way. It's just, we know that the Nigerian government, Nigerian elites are inordinately resistant to domestic pressure on democracy and human rights issues. And you have, all the tools of state repression, whether it be, crackdowns by security officials, being invited by the DSS to, have a conversation with them, or even on social media, right, where there's sort of an army of, pro-government handles that will come after you if you level that criticism and try to drown you out and sort of level ad hominem attacks against you to discredit your points of view. Whereas with the international community, that's harder to do. The Nigerian government has fewer tools in its toolbox with which to silence that outside criticism. So I think at the end of the day, like the emperor with no clothes, Nigerian elites care about their international image. They care about their ability to travel abroad and appear legitimate and be respected, and both whilst in government and after they are in government. And so that international criticism is necessary and should be leveraged by foreign governments and diplomatic missions, if they have that credibility to make those critiques, because international criticism, I think, pushes Nigerian elites outside their comfort zone and momentarily sort of interrupts or suspends, right, their ability to act with impunity. It sort of momentarily dispels, right, the sort of deniability that they embrace about the impact and effects of their own actions, which, as we know, are very destructive in many cases.
Yeah, Matthew, you've echoed this point, I think, in one of your write-ups with Jude, where you say that under Donald Trump, you're of the opinion that the foreign policy of the United States towards Nigeria was directly or indirectly encouraging the Nigerian government to, what's the word, not be impunitive, but to commit human rights violations. And you also have mentioned that it looks like it is continuing on the Biden administration. Does that mean that no international pressure is going to call the Nigerian government to order anymore because nothing seems to change?
I think it's kind of like a, drug resistant malaria, right? In the sense that, these sort of more milder critiques. I mean, when you talk to diplomats about this issue, they'll say, oh, well, we had a very stern conversation, with them behind closed doors, or you don't see everything we're doing to gain movement on this issue. And I say to them, well, of course, we don't see any of that. And so therefore, for your friends in civil society, the Nigerian public, I mean, they don't see, and I certainly don't see evidence, right, that those tactics are working. So again, there's this notion that applying the same tactics or the same medicine as that may have worked, I don't know, under Obasanjo, who maybe was far more receptive to these types of or even Jonathan were more receptive to these types of conversations. They certainly don't work in the current day. And I think, I think that you have a situation where over time, and we saw this with the Twitter ban as well, where if the government tries things, right, it sort of it continues to push the envelope. It continues to push up these trial balloons, do things that are increasingly unacceptable and at variance with international norms. And then they look for a reaction. And if that reaction is not forthcoming, then that behavior or that conduct sort of becomes the new normal, and so we've slipped down this slope, and that's why we call it democratic backsliding. And I think what is clear is that the international community, diplomats, foreign diplomats stationed in Abuja have, not due to their own bad intentions, but sort of due to their naivety and sort of lack of wherewithal, allowed this democratic backsliding to take place without calling it out. And I'm not saying that that wouldn't have happened anyway. I'm not saying that by calling out democratic backsliding, it stops it from happening, but you are bearing witness to it, and you are laying down potential consequences, both in terms of the relationship and how Nigerian elites are treated in these international forum. I mean, the fact, for example, that the Biden administration invited Nigeria to its summit of democracies, I mean, was a really interesting choice. I mean, to many of us on this call, that was a little puzzling. I'm not sure how Nigeria qualifies as a democracy in many senses of the word. I mean, certainly it stages elections quite frequently, but those elections are incredibly flawed and undemocratic in many ways. So again, I think that the international community has missed a trick, so to speak, and I think they've sold people like Rinu and Seun and others who are really putting themselves at risk to champion human rights, democracy, and good governance. I think they've sold them short in many, many ways.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I want to go to Japhet and Tolu right now. I'm going to ask both of you the same question, and also honing on the external or foreign interference or dynamic in the NSAS protest. JJ and Tolu, when the NSAS protest became very popular on Twitter, I was quoting for you that in the first weekend there were 24 million tweets on the hashtag. Twitter verified the accounts of some active NSAS protesters. Twitter created a special emoji for the NSAS protest, and Jack Dorsey, he tweeted the donation link for Feminist Coalition. Feminist Coalition was one of the organizations that were organizing funding for the protest. And tweeting this donation link increased Bitcoin donation to the NSAS protest. And at the same time, Instagram was deleting certain posts about the NSAS movement, and later they came out to say they had some technical issues. What's the reason why some of these posts about the NSAS protests were being deleted? My question to Tolu and Japhet, and Japhet would go first, is that this kind of actions that the social media organizations and companies that it took during this protest, does it challenge the neutrality that is expected from digital technology companies, especially in conflict situations?
I don't think it does. I don't think it does, because, for instance, would you say that Twitter creating an emoji for elections in Nigeria, which has happened before, would you say that that's a form of intervention? Would you say that that's a form of interference? I don't think you would say that. I think that we need to see it in the context of Twitter. So something has become very, very big, and they are trying to make you see that, oh, this thing is happening somewhere, it's generating a lot of conversation, and they're trying to say this is something that Twitter can be used for, e.g. protest. The same way when an election is coming, they put that emoji for that election, basically trying to say that this is something that Twitter can be used for, e.g. elections, right? And so if they did it for elections and we didn't see it as a form of interference, I don't think that we should see it as a form of interference if they do it for a protest. With respect to Jack, Twitter as an institution never directly tweeted anything that you would say made it look like they were supporting the protest. But Jack is an individual. I know sometimes it's very difficult to separate the individual from the organization that they work for, but that's why a lot of people on social media, on Twitter especially, say that they are not, whatever they post is to be. And I believe that even though some people do not necessarily put that on their social, on their bio, we have come to generally believe that individual opinions are individual opinions. The same way when you were introducing Tolu to the platform, that he was here to represent his own voice, not the voice of the government. I know the essence of stating those things clearly sometimes, because generally speaking, it is just assumed that this individual's bias is the same bias as with the organization that they represent. And with respect to Twitter verifying the pages of people that were related to the protest, I would say that, first of all, by the way, the fact that NSAS did not have leaders was in principle, not in reality, but that's not a question that was posed to me. So I'm going to go there. But it was in principle, in reality. If Twitter somehow had, in reality, identified that these were the faces, you're not going to knock that, except you knock the fact that Twitter are verifying government pages and the pages of public servants, because those people represent the institution of government. Is a form of estate of the society, as with the individuals, the activists, the advocates that represented, in this case, NSAS. So I also am aware that sometimes how we see neutrality depends on it depends on our own bias. So there's a possibility that I'm biased, that my response is biased right now, even on account of where I stand on this issue. But I just generally believe that the platform, Twitter, definitely was not biased. The role that they played could not be said to be a form of interference. Of course, Jack was biased and he showed it, but I personally am able to see that there is Jack Dorsey, there is Twitter. So much so that we've seen that separation, that Jack can be Jack and Twitter can be Twitter. Now that he's not even CEO.
But what do you say to assumptions that it was this absence of neutrality of Twitter, especially during the NSAS, that actually bedrocked the reason why Twitter was banned in Nigeria on June 5th?
Assumptions are what they are. They're assumptions. They more often than not speak to correlation than they speak to causation, right? And the risk of that is that you never know what you're dealing with, because if something is an assumption, one thing is, I personally find it easy to think that the Nigerian government, which more often than not is very, very reactive when it comes to these things, definitely had NSAS in mind when they banned Twitter. And beyond NSAS, it was a compounding. It was a compounding of many issues, many ways that they must have been feeling that Twitter was antagonistic to them. And I use the word feeling intentionally, because whether Twitter was antagonistic to them, again, is debatable. But in many ways, they must have been having that feeling that this platform is against our agenda and our intention. And it's very difficult for me personally to separate the action that they carried out of banning Twitter in June of 2021 from the NSAS and all the things that preceded it and all the things after it. And I think that the Buhari tweet that eventually drew the final sword was just the final action or the final event that definitely finally tipped it over the board.
Thanks, JJ. Tolu, what do you say to this neutrality? Do the actions of Twitter and Instagram, does it challenge the neutrality that you expect from digital technology companies, especially in conflict time?
Well, I think I sympathize with the dilemmas of the technology companies. I honestly sympathize. These companies did not start out thinking that they will be deciding, what views go up or what views predominate on their platform or anything. They started out Facebook, Twitter, they started out as they were communication tools. They were, we're going to change the world, we're going to democratize, we're going to equalize, we're going to decentralize, we're going to, but of course, over the years, as they gained more and more power and influence and popularity, then they started to find themselves in places where, they're actually now getting sort of enmeshed in national politics, in, controversial issues. I mean, look at the US, the there's the belief that Facebook and Twitter are liberal dominated platforms, that the liberals have hijacked those platforms. You find those views in the US, which is why you now tend to find like those on the right are now thinking, okay, we need our own platforms, which was one of the major things that Donald Trump was actually pushing, setting up, and people were setting up social media platforms as a reaction of sorts to what they perceived as the liberal tendencies of Facebook. But I don't think Twitter and Facebook set out that way.
Everybody calm down. The president is using the bus. Oh yeah, you should start going.
I don't think. Sorry. So I don't think that people I don't think they started out that way. So I honestly sympathize. I honestly sympathize with the dilemmas that they are dealing with, and I guess there's no easy answer. But I don't think that any of them set out to deliberately interfere in national, as JJ said. I don't believe that Twitter personally thinks that, oh, look, we will take, we want to take one side or the other. They are first and foremost their businesses. First and foremost their businesses. They want to, what they want to do is, maintain influence. There's so many things on their minds as businesses. They are looking at competition. They are looking at staying dominant. They are looking at many of these companies are quoted companies. They are looking at satisfying their investors, because they've got investors who are kind of snapping at their heels and asking. So I'm not sure. I don't think that there's a deliberate policy. DJ made a good point, with how we said, look, there's Jack, and everybody knows that Jack, unlike say Zuckerberg or other CEOs, there's a person that Jack has his own activist bent that I guess conflicted with his position as CEO. And now that he's no longer in that position, I guess it will help both him and Twitter. But yeah, so I don't think that many of these companies are out to take sides or to destabilize or anything. But unfortunately, because of the way they've been set up, as platforms, there will always be dominant tendencies, and people will use these platforms for whatever they wish to use them for. And I was going to also just say a point about, I think one of the questions you asked was about foreign or international attention. A matter like police brutality is a compelling case. It's a universal issue. One of the biggest upheavals in the US in the last decade has been the Black Lives Matter movement. And I use upheavals not in the negative sense. But people identify with the brutality of law enforcement agents. It's shorthand in a sense, easily understandable anywhere in the world. If you remember the Arab Spring, when it started in Tunisia, it was law enforcement brutality of some sort, where some guys selling fruits, just ended up being oppressed by local tax collectors. They may not have been conventional policemen, but so people identify with that all over the world, and it just means that it's very easy then for people, even people who don't know Nigeria, to understand what it means when people say they are pushing back against police brutality. So I think for me that's the context, which means that it's a message that resonates anywhere in the world, maybe even more than say an issue like petrol subsidies, for example. Sure. Many countries don't have fuel subsidies, so they may not understand what it means but police brutality, law enforcement brutality is a different matter entirely.
Thank you very much, Tolu.